Hello everyone and welcome to The Download, coming to you live from our Church Militant studios here in Detroit, Michigan. As we do every Friday on The Download, we have a small discussion about the newest release of the most recently re-digitized episode of our flagship show, The One True Faith. We produced the OTF 10 years ago and have given them a much-needed technical facelift owing to the change in technology. This week's episode is on the Protestant Revolt, what secular historians call the Reformation, in which there was no reform at all, but rather a rending of Christianity, which still persists to today. So Christine is going to talk about why we need to know the honest differences between Protestantism and Catholicism. Former Protestant, so she knows what she's talking about. Simon is going to talk about how Martin Luther's concerns were initially correct, but then he sort of went nuts, not shortly after that. And Brad's going to tackle one of the largest issues coming out of Luther's madness, the Sola Scriptura thing. So look, Christine, let's begin with you.
Yeah, well, what people don't know is the original script said that I was a former heretic.
Which is technically true.
It is true.
It is canonically accurate because we did discuss it.
I put it in as a joke. The prompter said former heretic, and then I forgot to take it out.
I was actually hoping that you would say that, because technically, according to the definition in canon law, heresy is the obstinate denial or obstinate doubt after the reception of baptism of some truth which is to be believed by divine and Catholic faith. You know, technically I was a heretic because I did reject some of these things, went on to become a Protestant, but we want to make clear that we're not sitting here calling all Protestants heretics. Because many of them are not, actually. Michael makes today we're going back to the One True Faith episode, Reformation. And before we get into the details of the Reformation, Michael makes a very important point and very important distinction that's important for Protestants out there who may be watching the show to understand. So let's go ahead and roll that clip.
Before we talk about the Reformation, which is today's topic, I want to draw a distinction. There is a difference between Protestant theologies of the different sects and individual members of those faiths. And what we're talking today here about is the theologies. We are not talking about the individuals. Lots of people come to their understanding of the faith, their faith, for a multiplicity of reasons. They were raised in it. They had a bad experience in another one. They never clearly understood this faith or that faith. There are tons of reasons, subjective reasons in people's lives why in vis-a-vis the Catholic faith, they either aren't in it, they left it, or they don't understand it. That's what this is about. So for anybody who's hearing this, we are not talking about individual Protestants, unless they're historical figures that we'll get into later, but I'm talking about in modern day. So if you hear this as an attack or something like that, is not what it is. We're talking about theologies, and part of the truth is that if there are differences, those differences must be addressed honestly, openly, always in a spirit of charity. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So this is not going to be a, burn all the Protestants at the stake or anything like that kind of thing. We're going to talk about the differences between these theologies. And there are substantial differences. There are substantial differences.
Yeah, we wanted to highlight that point. It's a very important point because sometimes we've had people writing in who are Protestants saying, I wish you guys would just stop bashing Protestants because I know lots of good Protestant people, etc. We're never, ever bashing individual Protestants. As a former Protestant myself, I knew
Unless they're Catholic priests.
Yeah, exactly. I knew many Protestants back in my Protestant days were very good people, much better people than Catholics I know. I mean, these people are, as far as I'm concerned, some of them are on their way to heaven sooner than some Catholics I know. Mike Pence, former Catholic Protestant, he's a much better Protestant than Joe Biden is, who remains a Catholic and received the Presidential Medal of Freedom yesterday. So we did want to make that point clear. And also Michael's point that we have to be honest about our differences. Looking back, I wish when I was at Notre Dame Law School among all these Catholic friends who were praying for me, I wish that they'd been a little bit more honest with me about the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. They just didn't want to go there because they wanted to be nice. They didn't want to offend me. Yeah. But, you know, we need to be honest.
Yeah, it's very true. And just for the record here, my father was born into a Protestant family, Nazarene, and even went into Nazarene seminary. Didn't become Catholic until 4 years after he married my mother, and 3 years after my brother was born. So, you know, I don't hate individual Protestants, but I hate Protestantism because it's a heresy. And the whole point of, you know, in this venue we talk about is to say, hey, you're in that thing over there. It's a heresy. There's obviously elements of truth in it, but those elements of truth are Catholicism. Come over here and get all the truth. That's the whole point here. And I hate individual Protestants. That's stupid. So, Simon, speaking of individual Protestants.
Speaking of individual Protestants, yes, my name's Simon Rafe. I was technically speaking never a heretic, but I was an apostate and schismatic. But there you go. So we can go around the class and see who's got what. It's kind of interesting. So Martin Luther, who was a heretic, and a schismatic, and I think, no, probably not an apostate. Anyway, Martin Luther, however, the reason he's not an apostate, he was right on a bunch of things, but one of the things that he's most right about is actually the selling of indulgences. So if we can roll the tape now from the show.
He was right. You don't go around selling, you know, shares of, you know, eternal life insurance to get your mom and dad out of purgatory, or you're a horrible son or a horrible daughter. He was right. But he took that notion and went much further with it than he should have. He took that notion of this is a corrupt practice and expanded it to say, aha, and that therefore means there is no purgatory. And there is no need to say Mass for people who are dead. And he extrapolated on it and kept building and building and building. He, in essence, the old proverb, he threw the baby out with the bathwater. And he didn't stop there. He came to the point where, as he started thinking about it, he's like, well, wait a second. If they're wrong about this, they're wrong about that. And if they're wrong about the other, they're also wrong about this. He, in essence, deconstructed almost the entire theology of the Catholic Church. Little by little, well, actually, a lot by lot, in a very short period of time. He kept deconstructing. Well, if we don't need Mass, that means we don't need priests. And if we don't need priests, that means we don't need bishops to make them priests. And speaking of bishops, the big one who sits in Rome, we don't need him either. Matter of fact, we don't need the church at all.
Yeah, so there's Luther. And Luther's initial thing, most people have heard the story. Luther goes around and issues his 95 Theses, which are 95 things that he wanted to discuss. 92 of those are things that, like, a Catholic could and should look at and go, you know what, we discuss it, and your position is right. Mm-hmm. They were issues of corruption in the church. This is a subject that comes up a lot within this period in history. We did our Houses Built on Sand show. There's 4 or 5 shows that deal with this period in history. It's a very important period, the European Reformation. And we're constantly saying, the church was horribly, horribly corrupt, and something needed to be done. Had Martin Luther done 92 of those theses and stopped there and just said, well, we want a genuine reformation, everything would have been fine. The problem is he went out. The classic one is the indulgences issue. He said, you know, it's wrong to go around selling indulgences. There was a monk called Tutzel who was going around and selling indulgences, selling these things that, one, you're not allowed to sell them. 2, you can't sell them. It's not possible to sell them. And so Luther said you can't do that. They carried on doing it. The reason they were doing it was to raise money for St. Peter's. So whenever you see St. Peter's, realize that beautiful church cost Christendom most of Europe, which is kind of depressing.
Yeah, it's pretty
There were a lot of
sad.
priests back then. They didn't have the seminaries really starting up till Trent. So a lot of the priests didn't understand the theology or how to interpret it or whatnot. And we'd have to say,
Kind of like today.
We have to say when we say the church is corrupt, well, we mean certain members in the church who don't understand what's going on, representing the church with a collar on, that type of thing. Yeah. So.
You know, he started with indulgences, but it didn't take him very long to get to the Bible.
No, once you start throwing things out, he threw out the teaching magisterium. We'll take a look at the one true faith here. We talk about Sola Scriptura.
Most of what Jesus said was not written down, unless you believe that everything Jesus said for 3 years could probably be summed up in about 15 or 20 pages. Because if you took every quote that Jesus said and just made a big long list of just Jesus said, comma, quote, and then said the whole thing, Jesus must have been a man of very few words. In 3 years, I don't think he probably talked worth 2 hours. We probably don't know, we probably understand right away that that's not the case. Jesus said an awful lot more than what's written in the Scriptures. It even says that in the Scriptures, in the Gospel of St. John. It even says that if everything Jesus said and taught were to be written down, there would not be enough books in the whole world to hold everything he taught and told us. So clearly, this is not the only source of information we have about what Jesus Christ came and taught us and wanted us to believe. Most of it was oral. Most of it was oral.
We have two aspects of Sola Scriptura. One, we have a teaching church and we have an interpreting church. Both the magisterium does both of those things. Martin Luther threw out the church with Sola Scriptura, basically a denial of the magisterium. And he said, well, no one's infallible. The church isn't infallible, the Pope's not infallible, and you can listen to me and because I'm telling you this infallibly. It's like, what? So you don't have a Pope, but now you're all your own popes. So you're all infallible when you interpret your own Scripture. Even a plowboy can interpret Scripture correctly. Well, wait a minute, you just said no one's infallible, and now everybody's infallible? There's no Pope, but we're all popes? So there's a lot of contradictions built into this. And yeah, John basically said, you know, in chapter 20, he said, many other signs did Jesus in the sight of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe. And then the quote that you brought out there in the very last verse of John's Gospel, very last verse, the last thing he wrote, there are also many other things Jesus did. If they were written, every one of them, the world itself, I think, would not be able to contain the books that should be written. So we understand that Jesus did and said things. The disciples got that, and they handed that on. There's 72 disciples, and there's 12 apostles, and they are talking to the fathers of the church who were around at the same time, Polycarp, Ignatius, and these guys. And they pass them on. The fathers of the church pass them on to the early councils, and the councils of the Pope pass them on. So you have a teaching magisterium that is a spoken tradition. That's not everything was all contained, as John says, in the actual written discourse, which was kind of a snapshot of letters and writings that the early fathers and the passed on to the fathers, which we call the canon of Scripture.
Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate thing here is what has been passed down to modern day contemporary Protestants is the idea that everything is the Bible. And that's extremely unfortunate. We produced this series, this Where Did the Bible Come From series 10 years ago. Simon wrote a nice little book that went along with the DVD presentation. We even put together this cool little timeline to show sort of the development of Scripture. What's the, because I think a lot of people have this impression in their minds that the Protestants that just there's the Bible and that's it, and no one they don't ask sort of the critical thought of, well, where did this come from? And it's not a book that was just produced. Jesus sat down and wrote a book and handed it to them. And this is 1,500 years worth of material, information, the life, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and it wasn't until about 400 years ago, in the year 400, that the church sort of finally agreed, here's the canon. Yeah. I mean, this went on for centuries.
Yeah, there was
centuries.
Early first 4 centuries didn't have a book cover to cover that had all the Scriptures to it. So what do? They weren't even written from the time of 33 AD until about 99 AD with the death of John the Apostle.
It's interesting.
So those 60 years, you didn't even have the things written.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the key points that you've got to understand here is that the New Testament, I mean, let's leave the Old Testament out of it because that's got its own history, but the New Testament, the first books of the New Testament written were the letters of St. Paul. St. Paul is communicating to all these disparate churches that he's founded and has associations with, scattered throughout the Mediterranean world. The only way to communicate, you couldn't send a text, you couldn't phone him up, you write a letter. So obviously these letters, they're containing teaching, they're containing doctrine, they're containing interesting and important things in there. People preserved those, and people would actually read those at Mass. Then later on, there comes to these things. There's a wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis, which he puts in the mouth of the demon Screwtape, but it's perfectly true. The Gospels were not written to make Christians, but to edify Christians already made. Right. The first thing that St. Peter does at Pentecost is he preaches. He doesn't pull out and says, well, hey, I wrote something, and let me start reading it.
Let me read this to you.
Yeah, let me read this to you. He preaches about what it's done. Now, and that was how the faith spread. Then it comes to a point, well, we need to write this down, and each of the four Gospels represents a different kind of strand of teaching, a different emphasis. You know, for example, Matthew is very much oriented towards the Jews. Mark is the teaching of St. Peter, very much oriented towards the Romans as well, because that's where Peter was. Luke is emphasizing, it's a very historical gospel. It's emphasizing that sort of aspect of it. That's where we get the wonderful things that allow us to put Jesus in context. John is this wonderful soaring gospel written late, nearly 100 AD, probably as well. Yeah, to the Christians.
Under the influence of our Blessed Mother.
Yes, and that is extraordinary. It really emphasizes Christ's divinity. And so each of these is drawing from different places, but these are written like during the first century of the Christian era.
Over 60 years.
Yeah, over 60 years, and during that, so you're looking at this
Bible
period.
alone, 3 generations didn't have the Bible.
Well,
And
not
then,
to mention, we know of the Gospels that in addition to those 4, there were 23 others.
Yeah, well,
there were 23 others purporting to be Gospels.
Yeah, there were hundreds.
The church,
Yeah,
the
of
Catholic
different
Church,
things.
the bishops, the clergy, the Catholic Church for 400 years, 370 years, had to sit down and figure out, well, this one is genuine and this one isn't. So,
Well, that's why St. Augustine said the only reason I read these is because the church tells me to. And he said that in about 400 AD when they got the canon.
This is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. So this particular episode of The One True Faith is timely. I mean, I would actually encourage everyone to go in and watch this, because you will get the truth about the Reformation, which you generally won't get, unfortunately, from a lot of leaders from the church today. A lot of Catholics are upset because the Pontifical Council for Unity just recently issued a document calling Martin Luther a witness to the gospel. Now, this is an attempt at ecumenism, an attempt at healing the rift between Protestants and Catholics. I personally think it's a wrong-headed attempt, because what you're doing is we're not being honest about the differences.
Yeah.
We're trying to paper things over so that we can be sort of get along well. Well, we need to recapture a sense of true ecumenism, not this false ecumenism that's been propagated by so many bishops, but true ecumenism. I think Michael does a really good job in this episode of The One True Faith talking about exactly what the Reformation was, which is really probably one of the greatest tragedies in all of Christendom.
Well, I think to understand the problem of the last 50 years, you need to understand, watch this tape, understand Protestantism, and then start to put that in context of where we're going in the last 50 years. Even with the Amoris Laetitia, with the liberal interpretation of some bishops and counts, they say that the church has to listen now to people, okay? And they're the ones that decide and discern and this type of thing.
teachers don't learn from their students.
Benedict said we're under a dictatorship of relativism. Relativism exactly unfolds from Sola Scriptura. You're your own pope, what you believe, because you know what? We all four can say, this is my body. When Christ said in Matthew 26, John 6, unless you eat the flesh summit, and you're saying it's one thing. I was in catechism. We all went around the table and all said it was ridiculously different things. And we were all right.
That's the biggest crisis in the church today, is the infiltration of Protestantism throughout the entire church.
I think in the intellectual world today, the biggest problem is the dictatorship of relative. There's no objective truth.
And there's no acceptance that objective truth might exist. The moment Luther says, well, you can all interpret the Bible and
you're all right.
It's like, so you're denying the very idea of objective truth. And that has huge knock-on effects everywhere. You know what? We're in Detroit, we're in Motown. I bet none of the engineers in the big three actually believe that deep down where it counts.
No.
Will the mechanical stresses hold? Well, I believe they will. Well, I believe they won't. You know what? One of you is right and one of you is wrong.
That's why Cardinal John Henry Newman said, you are either Catholic or you're atheist. There's no in between. There's no via media, because he took that as an Anglican. He thought, oh, this is just the via media, right in between, and that's. But he came to realize, no, it's either all truth or no truth, because everything, if you reject one, then that's where you're headed. Wherever you might be along the way, that's really the ultimate conclusion.
This idea that Martin Luther took this, the interpretation of many individuals at that time in the church who weren't speaking infallibly and how they're practicing this indulgences thing. He takes that, he applies it to the church, and it starts unraveling. If the church is wrong, essentially, heretically, universally wrong on one issue, then how do you know they're not wrong on all sorts of issues?
On everything. It is not even a question, do you know? It's a question of they are wrong on everything.
They can't be then right on everything.
Yeah, it would be wrong on everything. Even to this question of the sort of false ecumenism thing. the way so many priests today, with approval of bishops, and probably bishops themselves, they don't understand. I mean, people have to understand that Catholics have got to get out of their heads this notion that because he has a collar on, I have to listen to him.
Martin Luther had a collar on.
I mean, you know, yeah, you know,
and a habit.
We would like to assume, and Catholics would love it to be the case, that if there is a collar or there is a mitre, what is being said is trustworthy. That's not true today.
Right.
Maybe it's been true in centuries gone past, you know, many generations ago, probably was more true than it was today. But a collar does not guarantee orthodoxy.
Or a mitre.
Or a mitre.
Because you kick it up one, St. Father Hardon said that, you know, there was no heresy that ever succeeded without a bishop.
That's right.
Backing it.
There was, we know of a case, we're going to be delving into this a little bit more, but Father Thomas Rosica, who is the papal spokesman, or, you know, the Vatican English attaché, whatever the title is, big dude around the Vatican, is traveling around various conferences here in the United States, and just recently told a group of seminarians, and we know because the seminarians told us, and the people there at the conference, other people at the conference told us, that he was asked a question point blank, what's the point of the new evangelization? This is a priest, this is a collar, and is it to make everybody Catholic? And he laughed off that proposition. He said he made fun of people who he said, I don't have the quote in front of me, but this is a very close paraphrase, for Catholics who see potential Catholics in all those non-Catholics. Ha 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 ha. No, this is him talking. The point of the new evangelization is to make Jews better Jews and Muslims better Muslims. Wow. Now, that's a priest standing there in a collar.
Well, Hindus, you just got burned on that one. I mean, what do you do to Hindus?
You know,
just as a matter of interest.
Make atheists better atheists?
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, that's the point here, that you know, all of this goes back.
In the church since Vatican II, because it's not Vatican II, but since Vatican II, triumphalism, if you want to convert people. Now it's no longer converting, it's proselytizing. So, you know, everything's look askance at. You just leave everybody where they're at, tolerate everybody, and accept and embrace, and you're not helping anybody.
Yeah, and Father Rosica, I think people know, at least regular viewers know, and I had a run-in with him at the Vatican at the end of the First Synod, and he was like, oh, the church doesn't teach people go to hell and all that stuff and everything. So, I mean, I don't know why, quite frankly, I don't know why Father Rosica is even a priest, although it's just probably an easy living for him, because he doesn't teach anything Catholic, and he runs that Salt and Light disaster up in Canada, which, you know, I think 6 people maybe watch now. So, the hits the church has taken from this 500-year-old heresy have been devastating. Stop and consider this one point, Father Rosica. In the 5 centuries since Luther split the church, billions of souls have been deprived of the faith because of his heresy. Billions. The heresy was able to be ignited because of errant clergy. The heresy was begun by errant clergy, and it took off and spread throughout Europe by errant clergy. Where the bishops were strong, the heresy failed. Spain and Poland are 2 main examples. In Spain, it was Cardinal Jimenez. He saw what was going on, and he started the reforms in the church years before Luther ever came. So by the time Lutheranism or Protestantism came over the Pyrenees to Spain, there were people like, what are you talking about? We don't have those problems here. So, but where the bishops were weak and worldly, England, for example, it was already too late. Protestantism is a heresy, and it must be fought against strenuously. For the entire download panel, Michael Vorse, thank you for joining us today. Be sure and join us on Monday and spread this particular download episode around, because Fridays are always free Fridays. We'll see you next week. God love you.